This week's look into the National Park Service's deeper cuts calls for some lighter fare. It's time to go down east, young men. Or loggers. Let's talk the Pork and Beans War. It involves the King of the Netherlands, William III, who was also Grand Duke of Luxembourg. It had no combat, no deaths, and laid the groundwork for peaceful resolution of boundary disputes worked out by a neutral third party, thus King William. So here we are, at the end of the War of Independence, or the colonial disobedience, or whatever you want to call it. And in 1794, boundaries are still being drawn up. But, due to a decided lack of surveying data, the St. Johns River, dividing what would become Maine from the Canadian territory slated to become New Brunswick, well, there was a problem. No one was real sure which branch of the St. Johns River was the source. Where did it start? And then things were further complicated by the presence of the French Acadians. They didn't particularly want to be American or British, and so we end up with Cajuns in New Orleans, but you know all about that. And so, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, a bunch of soldiers on both sides out in the boonies stared at each other, across a mixture of American and British lumberjacks, each trying to take the most white pines for masts in this booming age of sail. When William stepped in and worked to draw, literally a line on the map, a compromise between the American and British claims, he was working with scanty survey data, tilted censuses, and weighted claims from both sides. In his turn, he tried to make sense out of river courses and mountains. And the compromise from a purely practical perspective made pretty good sense. But the U.S. was still feeling prickly about conceding to the word of kings. I mean, first there was the 1776 thing, and then 1812, and now this. So the original 1830-31 proposal was tossed out by the U.S., and Britain stopped waiting around for the Americans to agree to it by 1835. As a result, militia were raised, funds were appropriated, and forts were built. And white pine and other timber continued to be extracted from the disputed zone. In the end, the military buildup resulted in a few poor souls perishing of accident, poor nutrition, and disease, but the American and British governments finally saw the entire exercise as mostly a waste of time and resources. A map purported to have been marked by Benjamin Franklin convinced the American legislature to finally agree to almost the same compromise William III of the Netherlands had proposed 8 years before, just minus 900 square miles. That'll show 'em. Anyway, this standoff conflict, also known as the Aroostook War, concluding in 1839, was also generally known as the Pork and Beans War, since that is what the soldiers and the lumberjacks spent a lot of time eating. Beans baked in a bean hole alongside a stack of flapjacks and fried moose steaks or river fish when they could get them. The forts and locations of this conflict are largely gone except on old maps. But the Canadian-American border in the vicinity of Caribou, Maine is full of wild and beautiful places. The St. Johns River, whether it's a national park site or a provincial one, are completely worth the trek to see these wild places preserved by their remoteness. Episode 132. Baked Beans, Boston and the Other Kinds. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at one of the first foods to be strongly associated with an American place, the Boston baked bean. And when I say early, I mean you could buy souvenir bean pots in Boston shortly after the Civil War. So if anything, I'm slow in introducing this American classic. To learn more about it, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the baked bean out of the Boston area was one of the first fusion foods to come out of the new country of America, and it would go on to influence British and other global cuisine. So what are Boston or otherwise baked beans, and when and how did they happen? Well, the modern version can be found on grocery store shelves and cans the world over. Americans see them as a side dish for barbecue, for meat cooked out of doors, and generally as an accompaniment to any salty meat. While in Britain, they also often accompany meat, but more often at breakfast and also as a snack or small meal to be consumed on toast. The recipe of the modern American kind and the British kind differ, and despite the common name, are not baked at all, rather boiled and steamed in cans. But these small kidney-shaped beans cooked in various sweetened sauces come from a single source: clay pots of American beans stashed in the back of fireplaces, initially on the Sabbath when any sort of work was forbidden, but later they quickly became popular as a laundry day meal when there was just no time or energy to cook dinner. And I love the history of baked beans because they are the epitome of food and technology affecting each other. Baking beans is even older than the colonial recipes. Up in the area that's now Maine, there's evidence that the Penobscot people and other members of the Wabanaki Confederation were burying containers of dried beans in liquids surrounded by coals in holes dug in the ground. These beans would stew all day or even overnight, and those beans were sometimes sweetened with maple syrup. This way of cooking beans that required so little supervision and effort, once the hole was dug and the bed of coals established, this was a boon when every day had so many tasks that needed doing. And we're back with the three sisters of the Americas: corn, squash, and beans. So there was corn mush and Indian pudding for corn. There was terrible beer, vine apples, stewed squash, and dried pumpkin wedges for squash. And so now, beans at last get their star turn. There's actually a fourth part of this group, the sunflower, which was a major food crop before and after the arrival of corn all across the prairies and east. But it gets forgotten because, for the most part, Americans found the main food part they ate from sunflower, the tuber, discomforting or at least embarrassing. But we'll get back to the sunflower and its Jerusalem artichokes when Americans start establishing farms and ranches in the wide prairies. So, beans. Well, legumes generally. Back in the old countries, there were three main ways legumes were typically eaten. There was a peas porridge, which is a precursor to modern English mushy peas. It was made of lentils or, more generally, English field peas. These are a smaller and starchier variety than the spring peas, snow peas, and pea pods we enjoy today, and are entirely different from the black-eyed pea relatives we know in the U.S. as field peas. These starchy dried legumes were cooked down to more or less a paste. And unlike dal, which is flavored with a variety of spices and often thinned with cream, ghee, or vegetable purees, peas porridge was typically dense and bland, and when it cooled, it could be cut into slices and put in a pocket or a pouch for a meal on the go. Salt and onion were often the high point of seasoning for this staple of the English diet, maybe a little mustard if you're feeling a bit wild. But if you're eating peas porridge, black pepper was not in your orbit. The second way people ate beans were cooked in soups and stews. We have plenty of modern examples: bean soup, pasta fagioli, cassoulet, and the like, all with whatever local beans were at hand. These brothy dishes were typically tastier than the stodgy plain peas porridge. But to be sure, both were filling, especially in the peasant diets that were almost entirely bereft of animal protein outside of the occasional egg and rare celebration roast. The third way beans were eaten were the green pods, what we think of when we think of green beans or snap beans today. They would be eaten fresh as they appeared and then dried into a leathery item that would be added into stews and broths later in the year. Almost always, these were the pods of New World beans that had been brought back in the early days of the age of exploration, alongside things like cacao or chocolate, tomatoes, chilies, strawberries, pineapples, sweet potatoes, and the savory or white potatoes. But because these had been so well sprinkled about the Old World in the 1500s and 1600s, by the time America was established, few people were clear that these green pods and the kidney-shaped beans inside were actually New World natives. When the New Englanders in the Boston colony and the Maine outpost were figuring out what could go with their endless samp, that ground corn mush, the wide variety of kidney beans were a familiar and welcome sight. Sure, these smaller white, yellow, and red speckled beans were different from the beans and lentils they knew back home, but they were familiar enough, and many a stew and broth were made up, as was the ubiquitous succotash, that melange of beans that sometimes contained whole corn kernels, other vegetables, and even sometimes chunks of meat. Now, the succotash differed from the baked beans as it was usually made with in-season fresh beans and corn instead of the dried beans in the baked version. Succotash needed just a quick pass over the fire compared to the long, slow hours of baked beans. In colonial homes, the dried green pods were so ubiquitous, drying in the rafters of porches and main rooms, that they were known as leather breeches, because the pods had been split open to hang over strings to dry, and as they did, they took on a brownish wrinkled appearance of empty leather trousers, and quite a few waggish rhymes were even made up to make light of their constant presence. Because of the shorter spring in the New England colonies and the downright coldness of Maine, the English pea was less successful than the local bean crops, so peas porridge became less common and different dishes of these small beans became more prevalent. The baked bean of today seems to have arisen as an adaptation somewhere between the peas porridge of England and the in-ground baked beans of the local tribes. As the 1800s arrived, the new Americans, with their excitement about their much greater meat supply and their developing sweet tooth due to the constant stream of arriving molasses, they came up with a formula for this fusion food that would become the modern canned baked bean. So first of all, there was the bean pot. We think of many things when we think of Boston, but pottery is not one of them, which is odd since quite a lot of early cookware in the colonies and early America was made of locally fired clay. Now I know, I made a big deal about the affinity the early colonists had for iron, and they did. But despite the creation of several ironworks, there was just not enough iron. Partly because most or all of the iron was being shipped back to England, and because making iron things was an appalling amount of work. And so local clay was found, mainly by streams, just as it is today, and formed into pipkins and pots, pitchers and platters, cups and jugs, punch bowls and pie plates, milk pans, and chamber pots. Early pottery, both imported and local, is always turning up in archaeological digs of North American colonial and early American sites. So it was around and fairly common. And after looking at so many shards as pictures and in person, I've always wondered why early America didn't develop much in the way of a local pottery industry the same way it became a glass powerhouse. My own opinion is based on what I've observed and read as snobbery. American ceramics were destined to languish due to a combination of factors. First, like wild foods, pottery was seen as an inferior material that could be made and used by the poor and local tribes, especially in the Southeast, where there were strong indigenous pottery cultures. So making one's own pottery was a bit like foraging. It made you more like the savages. Second, the porcelain ceramics being imported from China and then Holland and then England were seen as superior. By the 19th century, why make and use local pottery for anything but the most rustic of needs? It appears that as soon as possible, the local stuff was relegated to working dishes. You can see this in the displays of eating and serving dishes displayed on plate racks and shelves all over the young country. For example, a large serving bowl made by a Moravian potter in the 1780s or 1790s in North Carolina soon had their work relegated to storing salt pork. Instead, the display and main table dishes were almost uniformly either metal, usually pewter, or imported ceramics. And if you were real fancy, you had silver or silver plate dishes. Much of that from plundering the Spanish galleons. For more on that, go back to episode 50 on British mercantilism or episode 103 on pirates, privateers, and slavers. Anyway, while the front of the house had the nice stuff on display, there was plenty of pottery in the working parts of the house, likely a pipkin, a small cooking pot in the kitchen, and crocks for pickling and potting in the pantry, or dishes the servants would eat off of. But if any pottery were brought out to the table, it would be the imported pieces. American-made pottery stayed in the working portions of the house, if at all possible. And up in the colder reaches of early America, one of the hardest working pieces was the bean pot. While in the southern reaches of 19th century America, there was much discussion and effort centered around keeping cool and preserving food in the face of hot weather and short cold seasons. But up north, in the New England section of the new country, people were looking for cures for chilblains and any way to keep warm. I mean, you can look at the dueling wardrobes of different parts of the country. Knitwear and woolens were much more popular up north, while cotton and linen woven items had a much wider popularity down south. And that's not just because more sheep were being kept up north. In the 19th century, just about anywhere north of the Delaware River was a popular place for ice cutting and sleigh riding for at least a few months of the year. As a result, a solid filling and warming selection of recipes were developed. Also, since among the New Englanders and the Dutch who stayed through the transfer of New Amsterdam to New York, only the very wealthiest had much in the way of kitchen help. Most people cooked for themselves with only a servant or slave or two, which meant they were always in search of dishes that would look after themselves. Stews and mushes and pies and pottages that could be made ahead and cooked relatively unattended were extremely popular. And a pot of beans that could be nestled down in a bed of coals with only an occasional addition of liquid absolutely fit the bill. Like the peas porridge of Old England, this was a simple dish, but this version was all American, or American fusion anyway. The bean pot had a fat-bellied shape to hold plenty of stuff, much like its round cauldron cousin. But unlike the cauldron, since this would only have small things put in and taken out of it, the top could be relatively narrow. And this was extra handy for limiting the evaporation of liquid, an important feature for an all-day or all-night cook. Also, instead of hanging and having a handle for hanging it, the bean pot usually would have more of a sturdy jug handle on the side. Larger bean pots would have two to make managing the heavier pot possible. But smaller ones that would be tucked in the back of a fireplace would have a single side handle. And this single jug handle style was a prominent marker of the souvenir bean pots that would start to appear around the end of the 19th century. While the English peas and lentils would cook down to a mush that could solidify into a cuttable mass, the fact that the American beans had sturdy skins meant that they stayed as separate beans no matter how long they cooked. And in America, with all that space, there was much more meat. And the cheapest, most common, and ubiquitous meat year-round was salt pork. You could make it yourself, or purchase it by the barrel, or as a single piece depending on where you lived, your finances, and your storage capabilities. If you had a house in the country or the outskirts of a city, it was common to have a barrel of salt or pickled pork, as it was commonly called, in your cold pantry or cellar that you worked through down to the bottom until the hogs were driven into town the next fall and butchering time came around again. So while venison or squirrel or beaver or bear or porcupine or raccoon or possum or bird meat might be added to succotash, it was a slice of salty pickled pork that was the essential flavoring agent for the baked beans. And as beans are notoriously bland and welcome plenty of salt, a cook wouldn't have to rinse or soak the pork before use. Yet another way the baked bean recipe was easy. And another thing, having meat with legumes, that was a pretty American thing. Cooking pork and other meats with beans, okay, it was also common in Iberian cuisine, but the English and Dutch facing roots of much of American food saw the cooking of meat with beans as an innovation. But America was not done switching things up. The original inhabitants of what was to become Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York were all fond of concentrating and sugaring the sap of a variety of trees. Birch, alder, and maple were the most common. And these syrups and sugar would at times be added to the simmering beans. But the early Americans also had access to molasses, which by the early 19th century was much cheaper for everyone, even somewhat near a port city. Which means even today, baked beans have a regional divide. For those down east, that is in Maine, or back in the squabbly interior regions of upstate New York, New Hampshire, and Vermont, the only proper sweetener is maple syrup. Birch syrup has a wintergreen tang that mixes oddly with beans, and alder syrup is just too much work to be wasted on beans if you do manage to make it. So as you work out from the interior, molasses becomes the only acceptable sweetener. Sure, some people will add brown sugar now, which is fine, but in early 19th century cooking, that would have been nonsense. Now, the question of what bean is the bean of baked beans was always answered with, well, what do you have? In different microclimates, different beans thrive. So as you travel up and down and across the New England baked bean landscape, you'll find many different answers. That said, the favored beans are typically small, again, a product of the shorter, cooler growing season. And the most common exemplar these days is the navy bean, a small white kidney-shaped bean that's also known as haricot beans, Boston beans, or white pea beans. And it is extremely popular in any number of other bean dishes, including bean pies, which, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself by about 150 years, but look those up for Thanksgiving if you want to expand your pie repertoire. So, how to make baked beans? Whether you're working with a hearth cooking setup, an iron stove, or an electric oven, the directions are pretty much the same. Just one of those doesn't require special coverings to deal with cleaning the ashes out of your cooking tool. So first, soak the beans all day or overnight. For the average 19th century cook, soaking the beans in water the day before the cook started made the most sense. Just before bed, remove the beans from the cooking water and bring to a boil for about 30 minutes. I don't know what that is in 18th century everyone had a clock time units, but until the beans are soft enough to eat, because now the beans are going to get their flavor from being baked at a temperature too low to cook them anymore. From there, for every pound or so of beans, you'll need a slice of salt pork about the size of your hand, a chopped onion, powdered mustard seed enough to cover a shilling, and a full teacup of molasses. Score the rind of your pork or cut it into about 1-inch cubes. Place half of the pork at the bottom of the pot and half in or on top of the beans. Some people put the onion at the bottom and some stir it in with the beans. Your way is the best way. Mix the rest of the seasonings into the beans and add just enough water to come up to the top of the beans and tuck it into a warm corner of the fire or in your oven at 250 Fahrenheit or 120 C for at least 7 hours or until you come home from church for the day or the laundry is done. Along the way, have a responsible child or kitchen scullery add a bit of water from time to time so the beans don't dry out. Don't flood them, but just add enough water so the liquid comes back up to the top of the beans. And at the end, you should have just a bit of a crust on the top of the beans. Serve your beans with thirted bread. That is, bread made with approximately 1/3 wheat flour, 1/3 cornmeal, and 1/3 rye flour. Acorn flour is also an acceptable mix-in depending on your wheat supplies, the time of year, and how the oats did. This bread, of course, should have been made on baking day, though if you have enough hands and it is not the Sabbath, it can be made from a mush with a little added salt and fat added and turned into ash cakes or griddle cakes if you blow up the coals around your bean pot at the end of the cooking. Now today, many people associate Boston brown bread, a wheat rye bread made with plenty of molasses, but that comes later, after the Civil War when cans are more common, both full and empty, to be reused for things like steaming bread. Now, modern recipes add things like tomato ketchup, brown sugar, black pepper. Oh, now we're rich, huh? And even more modern additions like baking soda to soften the beans, or paprika, or even chopped up jalapeno or serrano or chipotle peppers. Now, these all make perfect sense from a flavor perspective, but absolutely were not available to your average, or in the case of tomato ketchup and paprika, any bean cooker in the early 19th century. And I will tell you, I was a bit suspicious of all these recipes purporting to be authentic, including the one from Durgan Park in Boston that has roots back to colonial America, that had the beans cooking alone after their first soak, and then being added in with all the spices to bake with the flavorings. Until until I ran across more than one recipe that called for straining the beans out with a colander. I have seen so many spellings for colander now. Before adding stock or flavorings and pork or what have you in 17th and 18th century cookbooks. Yes, I'm sure there were people who added beans to water with all the fixins and then just let it stew for however long. But people who were writing notes to themselves or to loved ones or to future cooks invariably included that detail. Soak the beans, boil the beans, then bake the beans. And so it continues into the 18th century, into the 19th century, and beyond. And if anything, that is what makes baked beans baked. They are soaked long and boiled briefly to make them soft, but they are long baked to make them tasty. And twice cooking things is a very common English and early American habit. Boil meat and then roast it to get a good skin. Boil vegetables and then stir them into a haricot or an olla or an olla. While baked beans seemed like the simplest and most straightforward of dishes, beans, salt, onion, mustard, and some meaty pork to pull it all together, with the sharp sweetness of molasses, they are also an illustration that great cookery is in the details. This dish pulls from the American past, the far past with the beans, and the United States past with the pottery. It is a fusion dish as it blends American beans and in-ground cookery with a molasses extracted from sugar sourced all the long way from the most western Pacific, bound together with European pork, mustard, and a double cooking method. And these sweet porky beans, in about 60 or 70 more years, will end up steamed in a can and ready to travel the world over. So now we are exploring the long cooking world of stew-like things. Why not just dive in and look at all the sorts of stew that are developing regionally in this meat-rich land? In the early 19th century, potatoes are around, but they're still not that common. So what are people putting in their stews anyway? Well, join me next time and see if there are any lost ideas from the past that might be amenable to your stovetop, Dutch oven, or even Instant Pot stew rotation. Thanks for listening. Any email, question, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode lets me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. I love reading them. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Well, November 19th, the Women's Work documentary about women in American agriculture is coming to KCTBS in the Pacific Northwest. So check it out, mark your calendars, and catch this look into a different side of American food history. I also have my other podcast, Prize-Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, with co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. We use media from the late 20th and 21st century about our past to seek out America's real self. It's a much looser podcast, but it still has food, but now with fashion, fighting, fraud, and a few other F's, which mean that one's for, let's call it fun. And I guess it means that that podcast is not quite E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.